This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. Well, we haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett and I'm delighted to be joined today by a special guest, Brandi Jackola. Hi Brandi, how are you?
I'm well, thanks. I'm special. That's exciting.
You're very special. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is a conversation we've been planning to do for a while. It was actually Tony who originally wanted to do this chat with you, which gives us an idea of how long we've been planning to have you on the show and how long it's taken us to kind of get around to doing it. And I'm kind of aware, I feel like I'm slightly pinch hitting for Tony on this one, because this is a topic that I think he would have probably been better placed to host a discussion about than I am, possibly, but we'll see how we get on, because this is not something that I know a huge amount about, but it is something that I think is quite a passion of yours. Is that right? We're going to be talking about gaming and Star Trek, and that's something that's quite important to you, yeah?
Yes, it is one of my favorite things to do when I don't have anything else I have to do.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough, yeah. Well, as long as you're not doing it when you do have stuff that you have to do, that's the main thing.
No, I'm disciplined enough to do it only when I have the time, and it does not take the place of things that I should be doing. I make plans for it. I plan for it.
You schedule it.
Exactly.
You book your holodeck time or your holosuite time.
Yes, we draw lots, and then, no, I'm just kidding. It's just me and my husband. We don't have to draw lots.
Do you have to compete over which game you're playing, or do you generally like to play the same things, or is there a kind of...
Yeah, no, we have two separate systems. Mine is in the bedroom and his is in the living room. We discovered that many years ago, that the only thing we ever had a major argument about was video game time. And so we solved that problem by each having our own system.
Very good. Well, that's an easy solution, definitely. I mean, it's interesting kind of looking at the use of the holodeck as a kind of gaming environment in Star Trek. I suppose one of the big questions that I've kind of come across looking back over some of these episodes is whether the holodeck is essentially something that you do on your own. And obviously there are certain programs that would probably lend themselves to a solitary experience, or is it a kind of bonding activity that you do with other people and it's a kind of group experience? And sometimes that seems to shift, because say, if you look at Julian Bashir's kind of James Bond holo program, the first time we see it, I mean, the only time we really properly see it in Our Man Bashir, at the beginning of the episode, he's saying to Garak, I want to play by myself. Get out of my holosuite. You know, you weren't invited. This is my program, and I'm playing it on my own terms. And Garak is sort of making remarks about, well, you know, what is it that you're ashamed of about this program? Why don't you want anyone to know what you're playing? But then by the time that program comes back later on, I think there's an episode in a subsequent season of DS9 anyway, and Odo and Dax and Miles and everyone, they're all kind of chatting about how they're going to play together and who's going to play which role and so on. And suddenly it seems to have shifted in Bashir's mind from being this kind of slightly kind of secret hobby into being an experience that can be shared. And I guess that's true with gaming in the real world as well, isn't it? That there can be a kind of social element to it.
There can. The sad thing is that when you're gaming online say you're playing a multiplayer online role-playing game like Elder Scrolls or what have you, you don't always get to choose who you play with. I would only ever play multiplayer anything online with people that I know, because there are too many little jerks out there who just want to run around ruining everyone else's fun. And that's not my bag. I don't enjoy that. And so I don't actually play online that often. Another great thing about my husband and I having two different systems is that we can play cooperatively online if we so choose. And it's a much more fun experience with just the two of us, because we don't even have to get headsets. We just shout at each other between the two rooms because they're right next to each other. So
I once heard an amazing talk from a couple who were, it was the title of this talk, this was going back a while, but it was called Are You a GRL in RL? Are you a girl in real life? And it was all about playing, I don't know what this was like, I don't know, 10, 15 maybe years ago. So I think it must have been, what would one of those kind of old, like one of the sort of first online RPG kind of games. But anyway, it was this weird thing where they were married in real life, but in the game they were also in a relationship, but they both played as female characters. So they had this, they were talking about sort of what their in-game relationship was like and how it related to their out-of-game relationship. And they would sit there playing together, but they would be in separate rooms in the house. And so then they would both log off and they would come back into their real world. And they had this whole sort of alternate identity, alternate relationship, really, because their characters, as I say, were in a relationship, albeit a different relationship in the sort of virtual world. But I guess that sort of plays into one of the things that is part of the appeal of gaming. And certainly when we look at the holodeck, part of the appeal of the holodeck, which is the idea of escapism and kind of, I guess that idea that, Bashir should be able to indulge his fantasy life, whatever that is, without feeling judged for it or without, other people questioning it. But that idea of kind of it being an experience which is about sort of living a life that is not your life somehow.
Yes, that's a big part of gaming is everyone wants diversion from time to time. Everybody at one time or another in their lives thinks about what it would be like if they were a different person, if they were in different circumstances, etc. And gaming is a way to get that sort of itch scratched, I guess is the best way to say it. And so you can go in and do things that you never could in real life, whether it is because this is a completely different world or a completely different time period or what have you. So you can get that exposure to something outside of yourself and have some fun, also knowing that there are really no real world consequences for what you do in a game. However, I'm the kind of gamer that I can't be horrible in a game. I have tried and I can't do it. It made me feel physically ill. So I'm one of those people that's still a goody-goody no matter what I'm doing.
That's kind of interesting. And there must be some games that reward that and others where it makes it an awful lot harder. I mean, yep. Where like the easiest course is to go in sort of all guns blazing or whatever. But, I know there are a lot of games where you can sort of choose, are you going to play a more sort of stealthy approach or are you going to play a more sort of, action oriented approach and so on. And definitely I can see that would, maybe that taps into your personality. I have to say, I always, with those kind of games, have gone for the kind of more straightforward approach. And then sometimes later on have sort of thought, actually, I wish I had tried the stealthier approach. But it seems like more work somehow. It seems like more like hard work, more like the real world, creeping around and kind of reprogramming things and doing that kind of thing rather than going in and, firing off all your weapons and so on. So I don't know if that tells you something about me, but to me, maybe the kind of escapist fun of playing a game is the kind of action, which is something that I don't really, and most of us don't, unless we're soldiers or, I suppose maybe if we're in some kind of competitive sport, boxing or something. Most people don't have that kind of, I guess back in history. Well, they're not necessarily in history because we do have people who who fight in wars and so on. But historically, there would have been more violence in people's daily lives potentially than there is now in the 21st century. And maybe that's sort of one thing that we're looking for in some of those games. But maybe it's just worth clarifying in terms of Star Trek. I mean, the way that I'm sort of framing this is obviously we see the holodeck in many contexts. We see the holodeck often in a situation that I would not call particularly a game situation, in a kind of static, non-narrative environment, basically. So we see, for example, Sandrine's in Voyager, the French bar. We see the resort program that Neelix programs. We see these places where people sort of go and they hang out and no narrative ever happens. There's no real action. There's no sort of development. There's no sense of time passing or anything. And then we have these holo programs or holo novels, they're often called, which obviously, sort of makes you think of very much of the idea of a narrative. But essentially, they seem more like a game where you're kind of guided along a sort of narrative path, but there might be choices along the way as to where that goes, depending on what you do. The interesting exception, I think, is in Deep Space Nine with Vix. We see Vix Lounge, which is very much a kind of non-narrative, non-gaming environment. It's totally it's a place that you go to hang out. And then in the episode Bada Bing, Bada Bang, suddenly it turns into a game and they have to kind of jump through a set of hoops and they have to kind of face these challenges and so on in order to sort of kill the narrative. So there's this weird sense that actually in that episode, it seems like they don't really want the game. They just want it to go back to how it was before, where they could just hang out and eat and drink and, socialize and not have to go through, feats of bravery or ingenuity or whatever. So there's that kind of interesting twist there where almost the what you would assume, I think, or I would assume that the holodeck is more fun when you're kind of playing something rather than just being somewhere, is kind of turned on its head. They don't want that by that point. They just want to kind of, kick back and enjoy some nice music and a few drinks.
That is very true, but Vic is not your typical holodeck person at all. He grows and learns as Deep Space Nine goes on, to the point where he's just as real as anyone outside of that program. And so yeah, when this thing that was supposed to be sort of like a holo novel starts happening, they're just like, oh, no. We want our Vic's Lounge like it was, because Vic knows them. Vic's program could be changed by these events.
He could be killed.
He could be killed.
Potentially. Yeah.
And so I totally understand with and agree with what they did, because that was a place where they could all just be themselves and just relax. And there were no expectations put on them, other than to just be there and enjoy themselves. And sometimes that's all you want. And that's why Vic's Lounge was fantastic. Sometimes you want an adventure. Sometimes you just want to sit and listen to music. You can do all of these things in the holodeck, which is why it's so amazing. And it's something where you can recreate events for a trial. I mean, there's just so many uses for it, going beyond just basic gaming.
Absolutely. And I guess, one of the things that watching some of these episodes made me think of is there are elements of the pleasures involved in using the holodeck that are not just the kind of, the gaming element is part of it, but there's also there's the dressing up, there's the kind of experiencing it, there's the kind of awe at the manufactured environment, which you do get in games. I've had that in games, for example. I played a few years ago BioShock Infinity, for example. That was a game where really there was an element of kind of just looking around and taking in the environment, aside from the kind of action. Do you know what I mean? And also, with a game like that, I'm not going to give away any spoilers in this instance, but a plot that is quite engaging and quite interesting and quite complex and very much like a novel, and has a kind of, a real kind of structure to it and twists and turns and so on. But part of the pleasure, like I say, I think is almost that kind of just exploring this world. And certainly that's something that you see in some of particularly the earlier holodeck episodes. I'm thinking of The Big Goodbye, for example. We get Picard just sort of wandering around and saying, oh, it's so realistic, I can't believe it. Look at this. And they're quite, it's quite embarrassing almost how sort of, I don't know, sort of naive and kind of unguarded and joyful they are in their experience of it. But at the same time, there's something quite appealing about that. And, everyone wants to join in. It starts off being, again, a bit like Dr. Bashir. It starts off being Picard's program, and soon Dr. Crusher's coming along, and then Data wants to come along, and then they've invited the, literary historian or whatever he is to come along. And they're all just going, oh my God, I can't believe it. Look at this, isn't this incredible? And the thing it reminded me of in a weird way, particularly with the dressing up and so on, is I don't know, more so than computer games, because like I say, I don't play an awful lot of computer games, but I don't know if you have in the States, we have this thing here called Secret Cinema, which is basically they screen a film, but that's the end of the night. So you buy a ticket. They're quite expensive. They're like 30 or 40 quid. You buy a ticket and you go along, and you'll get instructions beforehand as to what the period is, what kind of clothes you should be wearing. Sometimes you might be sorted into different groups in some ways. So they'll tell you, you have to wear a blue scarf or something like that, but you don't necessarily know why. And you get these slightly kind of cryptic instructions, or sometimes kind of missions almost, to say, you need to go and talk to this guy and try and work out about this. And then you arrive at a location, which is always has been completely transformed. It's a kind of an abandoned warehouse or a kind of derelict office block or something like that they've transformed. And you go through this amazing experience of, you enter this kind of world. Everyone is in that period dress. They hire hundreds probably of actors for each one of these shows. And for about, I don't know, like maybe 3 hours before the film, and you still don't know what film it is that you've bought a ticket to. That's the other thing. You just wander around this world, and people interact with you. So, I went to one, for example, that was it turned out at the end of the evening, the film was The Third Man, and I had sort of worked that out after about 2 hours of wandering around this bizarre environment, interacting with people, that something twigged at the back of my mind. I thought, I'm pretty sure I've seen this film, and sure enough, it was the one that I thought. But a large part of it is just this pleasure of kind of exploring this environment they've created and interacting with these people and sort of trying to work out what's going on, and the dressing up, and you go with your friends, and it's a kind of, it's a whole experience. And it absolutely is the same kind of pleasure, I think, that we see, say, with Bashir and his friends saying, okay, who's going to play what part, and we're going to go and, we've got a new chapter for the James Bond story, and we're all going to go and enjoy it together. It's definitely got that kind of quality, and it's definitely got that kind of idea of escapism and being someone else for the evening. You're given a character and having to kind of play along with that. And obviously, that appeals to people who are actors or performers or whatever, but it appeals to everyone. And, even people who wouldn't normally go in for that kind of thing absolutely love it, and they can't get enough of it.
Oh, I wish we had something like that here. If there is something like that here, they certainly don't do it in Utah. So
really,
yeah,
well, you should set one up.
Oh, yeah, I don't.
Quite a lot of work, I think. But,
I was just going to say, I do not have the time to put in the amount of work that it would require to make that a great experience. So, but that sounds fascinating and wonderful, and I wish that I could do something like that. Maybe someday. They might have it in some big city like LA or New York, but if they do, I don't know about it. So if anyone does know about it, please get in touch with me.
Absolutely. I guess in Star Trek terms as well, of course, we have cosplay. I mean, at conventions, there isn't necessarily a game involved there, but there is that idea of dressing up and going out and kind of, it's kind of being someone else. You're not necessarily being someone else, but you're putting on a persona to some extent, or a kind of, I suppose the same way you are on Halloween or whatever, you're dressing up as someone else, but the kind of, that's something that in our society we don't do in our regular lives, if you know what I mean. That's kind of an exceptional thing that we get to do, to pretend to be someone else for a while.
Yeah, and I do dress up for Comic-Con, so yeah. Been there, done that. I always do it my own way, though. I'm not good at being like super screen accurate or comic book accurate. When I do cosplay, I usually put my own spin on it, because I'm not good at being really super screen or comic book accurate or what have you. But I did do a steampunk Wonder Woman last year, and really enjoyed it. A shield is very, very effective at getting people out of your way, because all you have to do is just nudge them. You don't even have to hit them. Just nudge them, and they part like the Red Sea for you.
Well, that sounds amazing.
Very
absolutely.
effective.
I mean, I think it's something that we don't get to do often enough, in a way, in our sort of everyday lives. And, Star Trek characters are lucky. They get to head off to the holodeck, several times a week, by the sounds of it. I mean, if you've got the spare time, that's where you're going to go. And there seems to be a sort of almost an infinite, a kind of repertoire of new programs coming out all the time, or people designing their own programs, and also sort of putting their creativity into that you can kind of indulge whatever it is that your sort of particular pleasure is. So, if you're Captain Picard, it's Dixon Hill, which I always thought was such a weird fantasy for him, because he seems so kind of clueless about it all in the first instance. By the time you get to First Contact, action movie Picard, it fits perfectly at home with Dixon Hill. If anything, he's kind of ramping up the action on the kind of noir setting. But, season 1 or 2, Next Gen Dixon Hill, it definitely very much seems like an odd one. Again, I guess with Janeway, you get her, her sort of Jane Eyre style fantasy, which I always thought was really weird. And I only realised when I was reading up on this subject this week that actually the reason she ended up with that story, which begins to make a little bit of sense of it, is they wanted to do a Wild West story for her, which obviously would have tapped in with Star Trek as kind of wagon train and all this sort of thing. And they decided it would be too expensive, largely because they'd have to hire horses every time they wanted to show Janeway on the holodeck. And they'd done that with Picard, I think once maybe, and they realised that it would be a kind of prohibitively expensive thing. And obviously they'd done that with a fistful of datas, of course. Yes. But that they didn't want to be doing that on a kind of weekly or semi-weekly basis. So they ended up with this rather kind of stodgy sort of Victorian novel instead. But I suppose there is that sense of, every captain has their own kind of, their own weakness, their own pleasure. And I suppose part of it with those two is it's this idea that they're someone like Picard is so serious and so classical and so kind of refined and this sort of Renaissance man, that it's this idea that he has, I suppose it is a bit of it's not a dirty secret because he's not ashamed of it at all. No. But at the same time, it's a kind of, there's a pulpy, trashy element to it.
Yes.
The fact that he enjoys this, we get that again with Odo reading these kind of trashy romance novels, or, these characters who kind of, their literary pursuits or their kind of entertainment pursuits seem slightly kind of lowbrow, I suppose. And I guess that's something that comes across with the holodeck is there a kind of lowbrow element to it? Or does it work best when it kind of taps into those kind of pulpy, generic, so you've got the kind of noir detective genre, you've got the Western genre with Worf and Alexander, you've got the James Bond fantasy. Does it work better with those kind of quite generic things compared to some kind of more sophisticated literary fiction we don't tend to get? I mean, we get Beowulf, but it's very much Beowulf as kind of action adventure, you know what I mean, rather than poetry, I suppose. Right.
Well, when it comes right down to it, who wants to go live the poem of Beowulf? Nobody. They want to get in there and slay things. It's just getting
slay the monster.
Yeah. And sometimes these things are called guilty pleasures, but I feel no guilt whatsoever at admitting about the movies that I like that are not good. I like some really terrible movies, and I don't care who knows it. And I have liked some really what people would call lowbrow video games, and I don't care who knows it because it's fun. It's just fun. And I think that not everyone needs to play some kind of scenario where it's highbrow and sophisticated, and who cares? Do we need that in our lives? Do we want that? No, not really. No one wants to go be a debutante at a ball, really. They want to shoot things, or they want to solve mysteries, or they want to be Lara Croft. It's just, nobody wants to go, learn how to do needlepoint and play the piano in a simulation. That's not fun.
Well, that's what I always thought was so weird about Janeway's fantasy, that, here she is, the captain of this starship, out in deep space, doing this really kind of heroic mission. And this really strong, confident, commanding presence. And yet in her fantasy, she's this governess being bossed around by these snotty little children, basically telling her where to go and what to do. I always found that utterly bizarre, that that's how she wants to spend her time. And I think it was kind of, like I say, it was partly because they couldn't do the Western thing. It was also, I think they were trying to they were always anxious with Janeway about, finding ways to feminize her and her not being too masculine and so on. But I think with that holo program, it just really... It just seemed utterly bizarre somehow. Whereas I guess with Picard, it was incongruous, but somehow it worked because you could buy that was, I guess that's the thing. That was a guilty pleasure because he got something out of it. He got to express a side of himself. And as we know, of course, famously, Patrick Stewart always wanted Picard to have more sex and shooting. That was his thing. He wanted more action. He didn't want to always be the kind of diplomatic, cool, aloof, sort of reasonable man. He wanted to do more of that kind of thing. So in a way, Picard finds that on the holodeck with Dixon Hill. Patrick Stewart finds it by kind of gradually nudging the character of Picard more in the direction of what he wants, to the point that, by the time you get to the films, he is kind of action hero Picard. And so in a way, Patrick Stewart sort of gets to play out his fantasy, but his holodeck is Star Trek.
Yes. And what a great holodeck to play in.
I know, because you can do everything, can't you? And I suppose that's the great thing about Star Trek, is it's so diverse. It can be a courtroom drama, it can be a romance, it can be an action adventure, it can be a morality play. And similarly, the holodeck can kind of take you everywhere, anywhere at any given time. I guess it's interesting, this idea of the sort of guilty pleasures or whatever, because a lot of these episodes that are the kind of, these kind of holodeck episodes. I mean, there's a sort of stereotype about Star Trek that you go to the well too often with the holodeck, that it's an easy option. And I was slightly dreading spending a week watching holodeck episodes. I was thinking, is this going to really kill it for me? But actually, a lot of these episodes, they are kind of guilty pleasure episodes in a way. I mean, like A Fistful of Datas, I absolutely love that episode. It's one of my favourite Next Gen episodes. Now, that is quite a cheesy, silly episode. It's not high drama. It's not, great. It's not classic Star Trek in a sense, but it's got a lot of charm. And I think a lot of these episodes they do, seeing Data and Geordie doing these terrible English accents and kind of marching around Victorian London.
Oh, so bad.
or or Our Man Bashir actually works pretty well as a kind of Bond story, pretty much. I mean, aside from being a Deep Space Nine story, it's very kind of meticulously plotted out. I mean, it's ridiculous, but most James Bond stories are basically ridiculous in terms of the plot, and it's done with such kind of exquisite detail and affection and character, which I guess is what you get with Deep Space Nine, that it really works. And bada bing, bada bang. I love that episode. Again, I mean, a weird episode where the stakes are literally, kind of like we said, in this series where the stakes are usually about, are we all going to be annihilated by the Dominion? Are we going to lose the war? Are we going to commit horrific war crimes? Is someone going to die tragically every other week? The stakes in this episode are we going to lose our rather nice bar, basically, that we like to hang out in when we're not hanging out in our other bar that we also have? And that's as far as it goes. And yet there's enough there to kind of propel the episode forward for 45 minutes and to kind of make it seem important. And I think that's kind of a testament to how enjoyable these stories can be, cheesy as they may be, that just as the characters, we see how much they enjoy them, that we can enjoy them, we can kind of go along for the ride in a way and really make the most of that.
I agree. I had the exact opposite reaction to A Fistful of Datas, not because of the subject matter, but because I am so freaking sick of Westerns. I could scream. Okay. And anyone outside of the United States, I totally understand the fascination with Westerns. But
you live in Utah, so
I live in Utah.
Probably, yeah.
And my parents watched Westerns all of the time, and we didn't have cable, so it's not like the kids had a lot of choice in this matter. And I just got so sick of it, because what actually happened in the Wild West is very different from how it's romanticized in films and television. And so it's just, I got to the point where I just couldn't appreciate Westerns anymore. And there are exceptions to that rule. Basically, if it's a Western with Clint Eastwood in it, I'm going to watch it. But for the most part, I just get so tired of it. It's just the same tropes all the time, and I just don't like it. I did enjoy the story of what happened to the holodeck and how they had to figure out how to defeat all of these datas. I did enjoy that part. But I'm like, oh, please, Deanna, please do not try to do a Southern accent. It is terrible. Don't do that. It's awful. So,
you see, even Marina Sirtis in that episode, I find quite charming and quite, I know
she's adorable.
It's incongruous, it's mad, but it's like, why would Troy be able to do a decent kind of, it's, I don't know. It's just, there's, I don't know. And I suppose that's the thing about a lot of these holodeck episodes is they sort of do push the characters out of their comfort zones, but you feel like for the actors, actually, they're a great relief in a way. Probably it's enjoyable to be in a different location, not to be on the bridge, for the whole time, to be able to go out, especially if you get to go on location, like to the Wild West sets or whatever, and even if it's not on location, if it's in just a new set and a different environment and new costumes and all of that, I think definitely you can see there's a degree of pleasure in that, and that kind of rubs off in a way.
Yes.
But it's interesting when you were saying about the real Wild West being a much darker story, a much nastier story, a much grittier story, and so on. It sort of ties in a way, I think, with this sort of question which hangs over gaming, and also, I think, to some extent hangs over the holodeck about, is there a kind of dark side to this? Garak says to Bashir, is there something about your psyche that this program reveals that you don't want people to know about? Is there something kind of shameful about it? I mean, obviously with computer games, especially kind of action-oriented computer games, there's always been issues around violence, and when there are, say, a school shooting or something, there'll be lots of people saying, is it the computer games that are making people violent? And then the other side of that is people saying, well, are the computer games an outlet for violence? And we see that in Star Trek, I guess, with the Hirogen, both in The Killing Game.
Yes.
And then in the subsequent episode in Flesh and Blood, both of which sort of tie into this idea of kind of the sort of video nasties and the kind of, the idea that you can almost abuse the holodeck technology. We see it in Deep Space Nine with sex, because we see that, they have this Vulcan love slave programs. We have these basically pornographic holosuite programs that we are hearing about, even though we don't generally see them. There's that episode where Jeffrey Combs plays that character who is trying to get a kind of steal Major Kira's likeness so that he can use her as a sort of holodeck prostitute, which is pretty, nasty territory in a way. And then in terms of violence, we see it very much in those Voyager episodes where it's all about the kind of this sort of sadistic pleasure almost that the Hirogen are taking in killing these people over and over again. And by the time you get to Flesh and Blood, you see these holograms have been sort of traumatized by it and have been radicalized by putting through that. So I suppose it sort of ties into this idea. Is there something, quite ugly in a sense about our desire to play out these sort of action scenarios? And are there limits to what you should allow people to do in a game? I mean, you were saying when you play, your sort of real world moral compass is intact when you play the game, so you don't feel uncomfortable about doing, or you don't do things that you would feel uncomfortable about. I mean, I have to say, I've sort of had situations, you might think this is mad, but like not so much about killing people, because usually in a computer game, there's a reason, either they're zombies or something. So there's say with the game Carmageddon, I remember there was this big controversy. You're basically running over pedestrians, but it was okay because they were zombies. So they made them green and they told you they were zombies. And then it was legitimate to run those people down, which obviously in another situation would be unthinkable. But typically there's a kind of reason, that they're trying to kill you or whatever. So there's a kind of a narrative that makes sense of the reason that you're acting out these acts of violence towards them. But the game that I found the hardest to go along with that was the recent rebooted Tomb Raider games. And it wasn't killing any of the bad guys. It wasn't shooting any of the, any of the kind of enemies. It was the fact that in order to gain, I think, experience points or something, you had to kill animals to hunt and eat them. So you had to, shoot these deer that are wandering around in the forest and so on. And I actually found that much more problematic because in the kind of, that's something I would never do in real life. And in the framework of the game, it was, they were innocent in a sense. They were not attacking me. They were not a threat to me. It wasn't even like in the original Tomb Raider where there are animals who are kind of, dinosaurs coming to attack you or whatever, and you're sort of trying to defend yourself. So for me, that was a kind of line that I felt like the game sort of forced me to cross, and I felt slightly uncomfortable about. But obviously, different games have different ways of sort of pushing those boundaries and kind of encouraging you to do things that you maybe certainly wouldn't do in real life, or that maybe you feel uncomfortable about. Or for some people, they don't feel uncomfortable about it and they enjoy transgressing those boundaries.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I had the same reaction to killing animals in Tomb Raider. And even Lara's first reaction when she has to do it is, oh, I'm so sorry, but she had no choice. She had no supplies. She had no food. She had literally no choice. It was about survival. And it still didn't feel good, but she took no pleasure in it. So that was the difference for me. But yeah.
Some people have talked about in those games, and this goes right back to some of the early Tomb Raiders as well, the kind of impact of, I guess just because we were talking about flesh and blood and these characters dying horrifically and so on, but the way that Lara dies in the Tomb Raider games, that there's an element of kind of, some people feel there's an element of sort of torture porn about it somehow, that it's sort of, it's very kind of horrific. It's very sort of, and I think that's definitely true with the newer Tomb Raider games as well, that there's something quite kind of grisly about it. And I've seen people sort of debating, is that are you meant to be sort of almost relishing these repeated deaths, or is the grisliness to kind of make you feel unpleasant and sort of, to feel something? I suppose that's the thing, is whereas typically in a computer game, you die, you get another life, you die, you come back, you respawn, you death is a very kind of a meaningless concept in some ways, because there's, that you usually at least have more than one life. And typically there are kind of save points and so on. These days it's very unusual, I think, to have a game where, as it was in the sort of earlier days of gaming, you died and that was it. You had to go right back to the beginning and start again. If you think of like Super Mario Brothers or something, you'd be playing for hours to get through it. And if you died, you'd go right back to level one and start again. Whereas these days, I think there's much more of an emphasis on kind of your death has a limited reality in a sense, but that maybe one way of getting around it is those kind of rather horrific sort of cutscenes, which do sort of, I can sort of see both sides of that, because I think they do seem to sort of take you out slightly of the gaming experience somehow. I suppose it's because your perspective is shifted. You're kind of stepping further away somehow, and you're seeing something that does seem like it could be in a horror film or something.
I can see that point. I never found it to be offensive in any way, probably because it all depends on what kind of person you already are as to how you view these scenes. We talk about safety and stuff like that in real life all the time, but the fact of the matter is there is no safe. There is nowhere you can go on this planet where you're not at risk of dying from something. And every area of the world has different risks, but there's nowhere that's safe. This kind of reinforces it in video games. It's like you made a mistake, and the ultimate consequence is you have a grisly death. And to me, that's saying, stop screwing up and pay attention to what you're doing and maybe find a different way because what you're doing isn't working. And so what it tells me is something I'm doing is wrong. So what is it that I have to do in order to get through this and continue on this story? That's the way I always just looked at it. But maybe I'm weird and different. I don't know.
No, I think that's interesting. I mean, I suppose it's a big question, and maybe, I guess, typically computer game deaths don't feel very real because the stakes seem quite low. And maybe something like that raises the stakes, even if it only raises them dramatically, even if in practical terms you're still going to go back and it's going to repeat over and over again, that it's a way of raising the stakes by making it feel kind of uncomfortable. And I can sort of understand it, because I think for me it's like it's not when it happens once and then you avoid that. It's when you're really struggling to get past a particular bit and it just keeps happening.
Yep.
Every it loads up. You try again, you screw it up, you die horrifically. And it's kind of, it's the repetition almost becomes kind of traumatic somehow. So I can sort of see that. I was kind of thinking also of, I don't know whether this relates to any of the kind of online games that exist in the real world, but I was struck by, in Ready Player One, there's a lot of discussion about how, which is, for anyone who's not familiar with it, is a novel and a film about this kind of massive online sort of game world, essentially, and all these people are on this quest and you can battle each other and so on and do all these things. But there's an emphasis on the fact that if you die in the game, it has really serious consequences, because you might have spent 5-10 years building up your character, building up your skills, building up your your money, and literally and say in the film version you see it whenever a character dies, all these coins spill everywhere. And I know you get that in games. I mean, where that happens, say I was looking at Fortnite recently, and that's a game where when you die, all your things sort of spill out and other people can come and accumulate them. But at the same time, it's not like that game lasts for 20 minutes or something, so it's not like you've built up a huge amount of things. So whereas I suppose in Ready Player One, the idea is it is almost like, obviously the stakes are not the same as dying in real life, but it almost is trying to make it feel like that by making the possibility of death such a massively undesirable thing, because it sets you back to the position of kind of a newborn with no status, no credit, no nothing in the world. And that kind of, which is quite different from the idea of, ironically in that book and in that film in different ways, there's this idea of the extra life, and that's what kind of resolves the narrative in the end. But that's an idea that comes very much from a kind of older model of computer games, I suppose, like those kind of Mario Brothers, or like those kind of, those old video game arcades where it was very much, you have one or maybe you have 3 lives, and then when they're gone, and you're right back to the beginning again. And I think that's kind of interesting. We don't really see, I'm trying to think whether we see on the holodeck that kind of idea of death or failure. I mean, I don't think in any of those episodes, typically because at some point the safety protocols go wrong and death becomes, real rather than a game, which is another whole topic, frankly.
Yes.
But we don't really see, we don't see the player, say if a group of you go and play together, you would think one of you might get killed and then have to go and sit it out, wait for the rest of the game to finish. We don't ever really see that. And I don't know whether that's because the narrative kind of, to some extent, sort of protects the player from that happening. But we see even, I suppose, in, another spin on that, we see in Worst Case Scenario, the Voyager episode, where Seska has kind of done her version of the Jack in the Box that you get in Bada Bing Bada Bang. Only in her case, it's deadly because she's deliberately deactivated the safety protocols, and it's this sort of weird game of cat and mouse as to whether you can survive. And then it very much becomes again this sort of sadistic, almost like, I don't know, one of these kind of horrific films that involves the kind of sadistic torture of people, putting them through their paces, whether it's Saw or, I don't know, Cube or something where everything's trying to kill you. Yeah. And they're suddenly dropped into this thing where it's turned horrifically against them, which I suppose is there in a lot of these holodeck stories. But usually that's because the technology has gone wrong rather than because there's some evil person.
Yeah.
Who's playing their own game. And I suppose that's the idea, is like Seska is very much playing, even though she's dead, she's playing the game in that episode. And it's a sort of game of cat and mouse, and they're the mice trying to, find a way of escaping from that and surviving. And I suppose it's very different, a kind of typical action adventure kind of game where you're going out there and you're exploring and you're kind of enjoying it all and having a bit of a romp, compared to a sort of survival game. And there are, I didn't play it, but there was that Alien game a few years ago, wasn't there? Where you, from what I read about it, you don't have many weapons. You're kind of basically hiding from the alien the whole time. And that is a very different sort of experience to want to put yourself through as a piece of entertainment.
Yeah, I didn't want to put myself through that. That's just too intense. I had the same reaction to, there's a video game it's a series called Clock Tower, where that's the whole thing. You don't have any weapons, ever. You have to hide until the monster goes away. And if he finds you, you're dead. And I did not care for that at all. And I had the same problem with Dead Space. Dead Space was just so overly intense that I felt stressed out all of the time. That is not fun for me. Especially when you have two other people on this ship, where I'm not even going to go into the storyline, but it's weird and bizarre, and there's a lot of gory things happening. And I'm just like, why am I the person that has to go around fixing everything? What are you two doing? You're telling me where to go and what to fix, but what are you doing? Why am I the only one who has to do this? So, and it got to the point where I think I was probably about 2/3 of the way through the game, and I thought, I'm not having fun. I'm not having fun at all. All I feel is fear and dread, and not in a fun way at all. And so I just stopped playing it. So I have no idea how the story ended, but there was a sequel, so the story didn't really end. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. Well, fair enough, I suppose. That, if you're not enjoying it, why would you carry on playing? But,
exactly.
I suppose there are games where, some are more intense or more kind of a scary experience. I remember playing System Shock. I think it was the second System Shock game, and that's a really freaky, creepy, scary kind of a nasty experience in some ways, but at the same time, it kind of kept me going. There was enough, I don't know if it was in terms of the plot or the kind of, what it was about it, but there was enough of the kind of narrative going forward to make that sort of enjoyable to play through and keep going, even though it was a bit of a kind of uncomfortable experience, I suppose, compared to a lot of games that are more sort of outwardly fun in some ways.
Yeah. Well, and System Shock was really the precursor for BioShock. And so a lot of that really weird stuff transferred over. But again, it's one of those worlds, like in all of the BioShocks, 1, 2, and Infinite, there's just so much to see. And they put little things in there that are just little Easter eggs. And that's what I love about these really massive games. Even if there's really only 1 or 2 endings and it's a story that's herding you to a certain place, they put so much stuff along the way that you can't help but be enthralled in this weird world they created. And I especially really enjoyed that about the first BioShock, because it was like playing an Ayn Rand novel gone wrong, because Ayn Rand's philosophy is so ingrained in Rapture, and it doesn't work. It's unsustainable. Her philosophy, it's completely unsustainable. And this game shows that. So, but it's still interesting to find out, to just walk around and find out all these pieces of the story and how it all went horribly wrong.
And there was a great balance there, I think, in that game of the kind of the action side of the game and the kind of developing narrative and the sort of teasing out the narrative, and the fact that narrative was not, it was very much not a game. With a lot of games, the narrative happens in the cutscenes and then the gameplay is kind of separate, whereas that was a game where it was all about, finding clues and finding out bits of information and sort of piecing together this story, I suppose, like a detective would almost, rather than it being fed to you like a film. And I think that's one of the things with games, is sometimes when games try to be films, they don't necessarily work. When they recognize that a game is going to work differently, there's a lot more pleasure in that. That reminded me a little bit of those, like I say, these secret cinemas or these kind of things where you're kind of, a lot of the emphasis is on really exploring, go into a room, open the drawers, pull out the document, rifle through, see what's inside, find out what's going on, basically. And that's kind of left to you to kind of find the clues and sort of, and work those things out. And, in the case of something like that, there's not necessarily even some mystery that you're really trying to solve. It's basically just the pleasure of kind of snooping around in an unfamiliar world and seeing what you can find there. And that definitely is a kind of element of the pleasure of those kind of games, certainly, I think. One of the things I thought we could talk about a bit, just because we sort of talked about this idea of dying repeatedly and sort of getting stuck on a game and getting stuck in a kind of loop of death. But and obviously then coming back from that, which I guess we see in Star Trek with the reset button, that basically the reset button is like a respawn. It is like it's a way of cheating death in that way. One of the things that I thought was quite interesting in A Fistful of Datas, and I'd sort of forgotten that until I went back to watch it this week, was they actually talk about the difficulty settings, and they obviously have a scale, because I think they start off playing it at the level 1, and then they end up having to change it to level 4 difficulty. And that kind of struck me, because as someone who doesn't play a lot of computer games, when I do play them, I always play them on easy. And then sometimes I think, am I just, and I find them challenging enough. It doesn't mean that I don't ever die or nothing ever goes wrong. But I'm aware that obviously a lot of people who are serious about computer games probably think that it's sort of almost tantamount to cheating to play it on the easy setting. And I've seen in some games that they emphasize, they say, play it on easy for the narrative, that basically if you just want to see where this is going and follow the story and so on, play it on easy. If you want a real a sort of gaming challenge, then play it on, hard or extra hard, or, in case of some of these games, there's some kind of ludicrously difficult level, sort of beyond the hardest level, where, you have to get through the whole thing without ever suffering a tiny bit of damage, or, using no weapons at all but a pickaxe, or, something like that. But it kind of struck me, this idea that, with the holodeck games, in that episode, there's you can play at different levels, and Worf finds it too easy to play on the easy level because he just sort of effectively wins it immediately. And he has to kind of ramp the difficulty up a bit to make it engaging for him. I don't think in any other holodeck episodes that we really see that. It sort of feels like the holodeck somehow is able to adapt and adjust to kind of fit the level of the player. I guess with Elementary, My Dear Data, we get the same thing, because in effect, the mysteries are too easy for Data, if only because he's read the complete works of Arthur Conan Doyle. And so what Geordi does, which turns out to be a terrible mistake, is basically ask the computer to set the difficulty level to Data difficult, and therefore creates a sentient being and all kinds of trouble. So I suppose there's that element there. But it just sort of struck me there's this kind of element of, they talk about them as holo novels. Now, obviously, a novel is not something, you can get bored and you can put it down, but it's not something that can defeat you. It's not something that you can find you're not actually capable of finishing. Well, maybe you can if it's a really dense novel, but broadly speaking, you keep going and it is all about the narrative, and you kind of get through it. And I sort of wonder if there's that element with some of these holo novels that, say Julian Bashir's James Bond fantasy, we don't see, before it all goes horribly wrong, are there scenarios where he makes a mistake and gets killed and then has to sort of restart it? It seems to me it's more likely that the program keeps giving him an out. So he might get captured, he might get himself in a sticky situation, and then something will be sort of dropped in, as we kind of see in the episode, where it looks like him and Garrick are, like it's kind of curtains for them, and then Jadzia's character comes in and turns out to have the key, and he's Julian, having seen enough James Bond films or whatever, works out what he has to do. He has to sort of seduce her and then get the key off her and so on. And he's able to sort of see the clue that that's their way out of there. And I guess in the context of the game that the holodeck is kind of presenting him with, that is sort of, it sort of feels like the computer is sort of saying, well, we're going to push you, we're going to test you, we're going to make it difficult, but then we're going to give you an out. We're going to give you a little hint. Look, here's a solution here. And in worst case scenario, of course, it's Janeway doing it kind of in real time, basically programming in, here's something that you need, for this particular problem that Seska's created. And so there's this idea of this constant sort of back and forth between the difficulty that is going to get you killed or that is going to make it impossible to win the program or win the game, finish the program, and the kind of this sort of impulse to sort of help you along the way, give you hints, give you tips, give you a way out of the seemingly impossible situation.
Yeah, well, and gaming in the real world is very much like that. It's not going to just randomly decide, no, you died in this situation and nothing you do will change that. There are always clues. There are always things put there by whoever the creators are of said computer game or program or what have you. Because sometimes, well, actually all the time, you don't play a video game or go enjoy a holo novel or what have you because you want something real life. You want something different than real life. And so you don't want the same restrictions upon you as you have in real life. You want to have that reset button. You want to be able to load that previous save and try this again because we are intelligent human beings and we can separate reality from fantasy. And that's why I'm one of those people I don't understand this whole argument that playing violent video games makes you violent. There is zero evidence of it. There have been studies done. There's a whole book published about it. It keeps me from killing people in real life. Without violent video games, there would be a trail of dead bodies behind me that is miles long. Because it helps me vent frustration. And frustration leads to anger, and anger can lead to violence. It doesn't always, but it can. And so I stop it when it's frustration. And it doesn't get to anger because I have this outlet. And the thing is that most of the time I'm not playing a game that involves in just killing everyone that I see because I can. However, there is a game that I have that I've played with my husband that is called Saints Row 2, where you're a gangster and you are starting a new game right after getting out of jail. And yes, that is all you do. And that's one of my guilty pleasures. But that's a much older game. And as games have progressed and become even more sophisticated, I find I don't need that particular guilty pleasure as much. I prefer, being in a post-apocalyptic wasteland and waking up after being frozen for 210 years, which I did not sign up for, by the way. I was being told I was going to be safe in that vault, and they just froze me, and then some people came and stole my baby. And anyway, long story short, I like the challenge of entering into this world that I know nothing about and figuring out what I have to do to A, survive, B, find my son, and C, carve out a new life for myself. And that is extremely intriguing. And despite the fact that there are not a ton of endings to this game, which is Fallout 4, if somebody doesn't know, it's a different experience every time I played it. Even though I largely make the same decisions throughout the narrative of the stories, still, there are random things that happen. And that is just so amazing and brilliant. Because it's never been the same experience twice. Not once.
Well, that's interesting if it's a different experience each time, because that kind of ties into what I was going to ask you about next, actually, which is, I don't know if like I say, I'm not a big gamer. I find, insofar as I might play the game on easy in order to enjoy the narrative and not get stuck.
I do too.
I mean, you talked about the idea of like getting stuck on a game or losing interest in a game or whatever. But there are situations where I've been just completely stumped by a game. And I suppose these days, since the invention of the internet, that is a very different scenario to what it used to be, if you know what I mean. Because you can just Google it and find out, basically find out what it is you're doing wrong and work out what you're supposed to do. And there are certainly some games, say Portal, the original Portal game, for example.
Oh,
I played all the way through that. And I'm sure there were puzzles in there where I couldn't work out the solution. I looked them up. But particularly the very end part of that game, there's that bit where it just seems whatever you do, you're going to die. Like you play what seems to be the last game or the last puzzle in that game, and then you end up being thrown into a sort of pit of fire or something. And because of the kind of sarcastic tone of the game generally, and this kind of quite the sort of mood that it fits in, you sort of think, well, is that it? Is this basically just an unwinnable game? Is that kind of the point? Is it just like, you thought you were going through this whole process, screw you, you're dead. And then it turns out that actually, and I only found this out by looking online because I felt like this is just bleak and miserable, that actually you are meant to do something. There's like, you're meant to jump through a kind of, I can't remember what the answer is, but basically there's a way out of that seemingly impossible situation. And then there's a whole other sort of final act of that game, really, which is where it plays more like a kind of conventional game, where it's a bit more kind of actiony, it's a bit less puzzly, and there's kind of a big bad person at the end that you have to destroy, and so on. But I just think, like, I would never, if the internet hadn't existed for me to Google that, I would have just thought the game had ended and been a bit disappointed by it and felt like that was a bit of a miserable experience. And I would definitely have given up. And there are many other games where I would totally have given up if it weren't for that. And the only thing I can think of is, like, before the age of the internet, the similar thing was there were cheats for games. And, if you played your games on your Mega Drive or on your NES or whatever it was, some people would say to you, oh, if you press this sequence of buttons here, you'll get an extra life, or you'll get an extra this, or you'll find a shortcut. Or, actually going back again to Ready Player One, there's that whole sequence which is explained much more in the novel than it is in the film, about a reference to a game where you have to go backwards at the start instead of forwards, and then you end up in this whole sort of parallel route that which is what enables, it basically is what kickstarts the narrative in the Ready Player One stories, is the realization that you can do that. But the idea of these kind of cheats and the kind of is cheating, if you know what I mean, is using these cheats, is using these kind of things a bad thing. And obviously we see that in Star Trek with Kirk, because Kirk famously cheated the Kobayashi Maru, which is a game that is meant to be unwinnable. It's, it is basically set up as a kind of, yes, it's a training scenario, but it is basically, it's like war games. It is like a game essentially, but it's a game that is supposed to be impossible to win, which obviously is very unusual, I think, in real world games. As far as I know, you can tell me, maybe I'm wrong about this, are always winnable. But we do see in Star Trek, we see the Kobayashi Maru, which is, supposedly a test of character, and you're supposed to lose and see how badly you lose and how you lose. We see it in Deep Space Nine with Bashir and O'Brien keep playing these games, which I always thought was really weird in the context of this huge war storyline where people are dying. There's this whole question over whether the Federation can possibly survive the war. And we know that Bashir, through his kind of statistical calculations and so on, with his genetically enhanced brain, believes that the Federation can only lose the war. And the games that he's playing are, yes, they play the Battle of Britain, which obviously they can win. Yes, they play some other battles which they can win. But the one that they keep coming back to is the Alamo, which they know they're going to lose. So it's a game where they're kind of destined to lose. And then they even play the Battle of the Spartans at Thermopylae, which again, they're destined to lose. And I think Esri has a line in one of the kind of late DS9 episodes where she says to Julian, what is it with you and these, I think she calls them annihilation fantasies. Why are you playing these games where basically all that can happen is ultimately you get killed? And is there something weird about that from a kind of psychological perspective? On the other hand, with Captain Kirk, you get the person who says, actually, I defy that. I don't accept that. And in that context, it's very much, well, the annihilation is life. The fact is we're all going to die. Everyone is going to face that sometime or other. And is cheating that death a kind of a character flaw? And that's definitely the sense you get with Captain Kirk. Certainly in the Prime universe, I think in Wrath of Khan, you get a sense that this is a weakness in his character. This is a refusal to engage with the human condition, which on one level is sort of what Star Trek is all about. By the time you get to the Kelvin timeline, it has a slightly different spin, because it all seems to be about the kind of pleasure of cheeky Kirk and, how he's doing it, munching his apple at the same time, and it's sort of played for laughs rather than drama. But certainly in that original version, in the Wrath of Khan, it's kind of, he's a cheat, and that is a serious problem potentially for him.
Yeah, it is. However, the what he cheated was something that was a test. He cheated on a test. He didn't cheat on a game. He cheated on a test. And that is a very different situation.
But if the test is a game, then I suppose that's the,
it's not a game. It's not a game. It's a simulation. And there are many possible outcomes, but all of them result in failure because it's a test of character.
That's true.
But he didn't like that, and so he cheated. He reprogrammed the simulation so that he could win it. And that is
Deanna
just cheating on a test.
Well, I suppose, yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe you're right. we should have Amy on here to talk to us about that. I was just thinking about Deanna. Obviously, has her simulation where she has to, the kind of Kill Geordie simulation, and I think I haven't seen that episode for a while. But doesn't Riker give her a slight hint? I feel like there's a kind of element of he doesn't exactly. It's not cheating exactly, but he definitely says something that slightly nudges her in the right direction. Which obviously, I suppose, a teacher might do with a test, but it's true. I guess in that situation, it seems more like a test, and I don't know why that is. It seems more like a test than the reason it seems like a test with Deanna is because it has an answer, because there is a correct answer, and eventually she works out what the answer is, and she does it. The reason I struggle with the idea of the Kobayashi Maru as a test is because it's unwinnable, because there is no right answer. That
but
makes
it's a
it seem more like a
psychological
game to me.
test. No, it's a
but how are they
psychological
marked?
test.
I mean, we don't. Well, I guess we never see the 50 cadets who sit that test that week or whatever. What is it that's written in their log? I suppose it is all the elements of kind of heroism, and it is a test of character. At the same time, they know it's not real. I've always had a slight problem with that. It's not a real scenario. It's kind of it's a fantasy. But yeah, I guess and I guess that in itself is an interesting question. Can you deduce something about someone's, I'm going to call it a game again. I understand it's not a game, it's a test. But, can you, by watching how someone plays a game, can you learn something about their real personality or how they would deal with something in reality? And I suppose arguably you can, or at least we think you can, insofar as, say, if someone is a cheat, or if someone is, not even a cheat. I mean, if you think of like the DS9 episode where they play the Vulcans at baseball, it's not even about cheating, but it's about attitude, and it's about kind of not having a sportsmanlike attitude. And having a sportsmanlike attitude is partly about putting aside your desire to win to some extent in order to kind of have respect for your opponent and that kind of thing. And we value, in terms of sports and those kind of games, we value those things very highly. But do we kind of have the same idea when we're talking about video games or computer games or whatever, that the way that someone plays these games is a fair reflection on their real personality? Or do we just accept, well, it's just a game? It's not the way that Dr. Bashir handles his James Bond fantasy. Does it tell us anything about Dr. Bashir as a person in the real world? And does, or it's hard to tell because, of course, often in Star Trek, it stops being a game. So you could say in that episode, Our Man Bashir, there's a dispute between Bashir and Garak about whether to let people die. And Bashir is saying, no, we've got to save them all. But obviously he knows it's real. If it was just a game, would he have the same attitude?
Yeah, that's the thing. I think that there are aspects of games that will bring aspects of a person's personality to light. But I don't think that the way that you play a video game is the end-all and be-all commentary on what you're like in real life. Because at the end of the day, it is escapism. You are becoming someone other than who you are. And I feel that, yes, I'm the person that is still a goody-goody in a game. Except if I'm playing Saints Row 2. Oh no, I just blow everybody up. So what does that say about me? It's a difficult thing to gauge a person's personality just from watching them play, how they play a game. Yes, it does give insights, but it doesn't give you all the facts. It is just part of a puzzle because a person's psyche is massively complex. Video games are just a small part of that.
Absolutely. Of course, that's true. I'm just wondering whether, maybe in real life it doesn't, but in Star Trek, do these things give us an insight into those characters? And partly the reason I'm asking this is I'm thinking that a lot of the kind of gamers that we see in Star Trek, I mean, I know we talked about Janeway in our holonovel and so on, but it feels like there is a kind of link. And obviously in the real world, there's this kind of assumption that it's only men and boys that play computer games, particularly boys. There's this idea that it's a kind of young man's thing. And in fact, we know this isn't necessarily the case. There are many female gamers. I think there may even be more female gamers than male ones in some studies and so on. But I feel like Star Trek definitely taps into this sort of idea, certainly when you look at the kind of action adventure kind of games, so we've got Picard playing his kind of gumshoe scenario. We've got Bashir playing his James Bond fantasy. And these are kind of quite unreconstructed models of masculinity that these men are playing into. They're very much about the action adventure. They're also very much about the women throwing themselves at you, whether it's the femme fatale in Picard's office, he's always covered in lipstick or whatever, whether it's, Julian Bashir seems to have about 3 or 4 hollow women on the go at one time in a kind of classic James Bond kind of style. There's this idea that they're kind of boys' games. And, in Voyager, it's Tom Paris who's the one who's obsessed with the holodeck. Tom Paris is very much the kind of unreconstructed, sort of frat boy kind of guy on the ship in a sense. And in that program, in the Captain Proton program, they talk about Harry Kim has a line about, he says, isn't this the chapter with the slave girls in it? It's just quite an unpleasant, again, sort of unreconstructed attitude, especially from Harry Kim, who you don't really expect that from. And you definitely see it with Paris, because by the time you get to the end of Voyager and he's married and he's expecting a baby and so on, he actually says to Harry Kim, I think it's time to sort of put Captain Proton away. I'm not Captain Proton anymore. I'm grown up. I'm a mature adult in a sense. And so there's this kind of assumption, it's almost like, now I'm putting away childish things, that somehow his gaming is this kind of element of his youth and his kind of childishness. And the thing it reminded me of, actually, funnily enough, is a moment in Star Trek, which is one of my least favorite moments in the whole of Star Trek, just because it was, I think it was the point that I would say that my kind of, people talk about franchise fatigue. This was the point that slightly killed my love of Star Trek to some extent, was the moment in Insurrection where Riker orders the joystick in order to fly the Enterprise like he's playing a computer game, basically. And again, it ties into this idea. This is this film where, he's shaved his beard, everyone's getting younger, everyone's getting reckless, everyone's kind of acting out. And of course, it's Riker, Riker, who's the kind of most alpha male, who's the most sort of, he's not actually a kind of unreconstructed version of masculinity, because in fact, Riker is quite, a bit like Kirk, is better on those kind of issues in terms of the sort of romancing and so on than maybe culturally we sort of assume. But at the same time, he's the character who's kind of associated with all of that. And here he's the one who wants to, have, it's even described, I looked it up in the script, because if you read Michael Pillar's book on Insurrection, he talks about it. It's called A Computer Gamester's Dream, is how the script describes that joystick. And that for me was the point. I remember watching it in the cinema and just thinking, oh, for goodness sake, this is ridiculous, But again, it sort of ties into that thing. I felt it was ridiculous exactly because I suppose I think, okay, they can go on the holodeck and play out these kind of childish adventures or whatever, but Riker is captaining at that point a Federation starship in Star Trek. This is a serious business. There are serious stakes. There's a kind of real drama going on, supposedly. And it seems out of place for him to call for this joystick, which immediately puts you into this kind of jokey idea of he's just messing around, he's just having fun. Do you know what I mean? I can see from looking at you that you're skeptical about this interpretation. Maybe you see that joystick moment differently from me, but for me it was definitely a kind of, partly I think it was a joke that fell flat. Like, I didn't think it was funny, and I didn't think it was the right moment for a joke. But also I just felt, thinking about it, it ties very much into some sort of idea of like Riker reasserting this kind of macho, male, heroic side of himself in that film. I think that's sort of part of what's going on in that scene.
No, I understand exactly where you're coming from on this, but the way, and I agree with your interpretation of the events, it is rather silly, but there's this part of me that says, oh yes, but a joystick is based on the joystick in aircraft. And so when it goes right back down to it, that's still the way we control most of our aircraft, is with a joystick. So
that is true. That is true. No, that is a fair point. And
but again, the only justification I could make for it is that it is much easier to control slight movements with a joystick than it is with a direction pad or with buttons. And when you see Enterprise, for the most part, do you ever see a joystick anywhere else in the navigation station? No, you're controlling with buttons. And so the only thing I can think of is that he wanted something that would respond more quickly to his reflexive movements. That's the only justification I can put forward, but I still think it's silly, like you do.
I get that. I do understand the rationale behind it, and I remember, at the time when I was a kid and I played more computer games, I bought some fancy joystick, and it was all this, some Microsoft joystick that was all about being more similar to a real pilot's joystick or whatever, and exactly that. I suppose exactly that idea that, like, especially for a typically male teenager or whatever, that having there is. I don't want to go into the symbology surrounding the joystick.
No, I know.
But,
I know.
I don't think we need to. But there is a kind of fetishization of the joystick as this kind of, like, I mean, even the name, as this kind of object, this sort of male object, I suppose, in a sense, and that maybe that kind of plays into that. But I get your point. I suppose for me, the fact is, we've seen a lot of Star Trek by that point in 1998 or whatever it is. Yes. They don't use joysticks to fly their ships. They use LCARS displays and so on. They use a completely different technology, and we know that. And I guess in Star Trek, where it comes up again, there's a joystick in the Delta Flyer, isn't there? Because it's Tom Paris, and it's this kind of unreconstructed retro kind of idea of sort of this kind of old-fashioned idea somehow. And again, in the Kelvin films, you get that. It's not exactly a joystick, but you get that kind of throttle thing, which again I have a slight problem with, because I suppose partly because it just seems so physical, and these are such high tech, such sophisticated machines. And I know you're right, like pilots on planes have joysticks, but they also have hundreds of buttons, and it's all very elaborate. It just feels a bit sort of, I don't know, it feels a bit sort of basic to me.
No, I get that. However, there is a joystick on the Enterprise NX-01 in Star Trek Enterprise. They don't use it very often, but it does get used a few times when they do have to fly manually.
Maybe that's what it is. Okay, fine. Yeah, and that didn't bother me as much. I don't know why but I think it's also that it's smaller. It's not the thing about the insurrection moment is it comes up on its own, like plinth, doesn't it? It's kind of, it's almost like it's like Games Master
really
or something.
silly.
It's like some kind of massively OTT. You almost expect the spotlight to kind of come on and kind of dramatic music, and Riker's standing there and smoke billowing around him. So I don't know. To me, that moment, aside from being a slightly failed joke, is just ludicrous on many levels. But anyway, we can move on from that. One episode that maybe is not quite as such an obvious one, because it's not about the holodeck, but I thought it might be worth discussing here while we're talking about gaming, because it's probably the closest in some ways it's the closest to the kind of games that we have played in our in real world. It's the game, obviously, the TNG episode, the game. Okay, it's not about the holodeck, but it is about these things that you wear on your head, and they kind of feed right in. And there's definitely an interesting sense in there. I mean, I know there's a kind of, you might say, if it's another sort of next gen, sort of after school special or whatever, it seems like a sort of drugs analogy, and definitely that's there. But there's also this idea of, I suppose, this idea of addiction, and people do get addicted to computer games. Famously, you hear occasionally of people dying because they never leave to go and eat or drink or whatever. And that's something again that comes up very much in Ready Player One, is the kind of wastage of the body if you spend too much time in this kind of imaginary world. There's also that sense in the game, because it gives them endorphins, of it's almost like a kind of sex toy somehow, that game. There's this kind of these kind of, especially like the kind of noises that Deanna and Beverly and so on are making when they're playing it. There's definitely that kind of suggestion that this sort of endorphin rush is kind of illicit somehow. And I suppose there's that element there with again, some of these negative associations we have with games. Do people spend too much time in them? Are they tapping into something kind of illicit, something shameful almost?
I can see that, but you can actually put that on many forms of entertainment, not just gaming. It is not gaming alone that is causing that reaction. Because if people are predisposed to having that kind of reaction, they're going to find it, whether it's in gaming, whether it's in porn, no matter what is out there, they're going to find the thing that scratches that itch. And for some people, they find it in gaming. For some people, they find it elsewhere. Some people completely escape reality by writing fan fiction about themselves. I mean, there are endless ways to make yourself part of that imaginary world and then want to stay there. And that isn't necessarily what happens to the whole. That is a person that has some kind of situation going on in their brain that they do not like the real world, and so they find every excuse they can to escape it. And for some people, that's gaming. And so I don't think that kind of reaction and those kind of situations are specific to gaming. People just like to point at gaming because they think it's a base form of entertainment. And I disagree with that. There are many, many levels to gaming.
Literally, yeah, absolutely.
Literally and figuratively.
The thing that watching the game reminded me of is, I don't know if you ever had this game, and I don't think it really lived up to its name. There was a game called Endorphin, which was like an old sort of PC game, and it played these weird sort of trippy sound effects, and it had this. It was almost like a sort of Tetris kind of game. You were moving this thing around the screen and you're trying to line up like a sort of Rubik's Cube, kind of like it was a puzzle basically. But as well as the puzzle, there were all these noises. It flashed positive messages at you. It played this weird music, and the idea was that supposedly it was going to actually make you feel happy, basically by triggering endorphins, by having all this kind of subliminal effect, by this kind of weird trancey music and so on. And so there was this idea. The game slightly reminded me of that. Although obviously it given a sinister tinge. I mean, personally, I tried this game and I just found it a slightly boring puzzle game. But, so I don't know if it really worked for anyone. But the thing that the game did remind me of, I have to say, is there is this sort of element of a time sink about certain kinds of games. Maybe not actually so much the games that you play that are kind of all consuming, where you've got the sound and you've got the kind of big screen and everything. But the kind of games we play on our phones are very much like that. They are quite addictive, if it's Angry Birds, or like I play Star Trek Timelines. That is a massive time sink that that you kind of have to keep going back to the game and checking on things and checking on this and checking on that and so on. And it does become a sort of, I don't know if it's addictive exactly, but it becomes a kind of habit that takes over a part of your life in a way that is not necessarily entirely positive. But the other thing I was thinking about is just in terms of links between Star Trek and the real world. I mean, obviously, the games that we see people playing in Star Trek are typically holographic recreations of kind of literature, film, things from the real world that we recognize, that we wish were interactive. Obviously, there are a lot of Star Trek games out there. I mean, I played, when I was younger, all the Star Trek games I could. The one I really remember was the next-gen game of Final Unity. Did you ever play that one? Which was like...
I have not.
Well, at the time, it was cutting edge. I remember, because I had to go and buy an extra, however, I was going to say 8 megabytes. I don't know if that would even be right. An extra little thing of RAM to stick in my computer to make it play this game. And I was so excited about this actually quite slightly plodding game where you're gradually moving the Star Trek characters back and forth around the screen. But they had the whole of the next-gen cast voicing it and everything. And it did play out, just in terms of the story, it did play out like a nice sort of extra episode of the show. Then you've got things like, obviously, Star Trek Online, which is maybe a bit more like the holodeck in that there's more of an element of exploration. It's less linear. I mean, obviously, Star Trek's done these kind of linear games. They were like the Elite Force games, the Voyager games, which were basically first-person shooters with a kind of Voyager storyline attached. But I suppose once you get to Star Trek Online, there's that kind of openness. And then there's the game, I mean, I haven't played it because I don't have the equipment for it, but there's that virtual reality, what is it called? Bridge Crew? Is that right? Star Trek game that's quite new.
I've seen
that
videos
to
of
me
playing that.
Very much. What's that? Sorry.
I'm sorry. I've seen videos of people playing that.
Right.
It is crazy.
Really?
Crazy. Yeah. It's just so realistic.
Really?
To a level that I just thought I would be falling over because I'd reach out to touch things, but in real life those things are not there and I'd be on the floor. So it's extremely well done from what I've seen.
That is interesting, and also I suppose the fact that you play in a team, right? So you play, you don't just play on your own, which makes sense because I think one of the things I found when I have played Star Trek games before is like with the space combat, you kind of have to do everything because you're the player, and therefore there's something about it that doesn't really feel very Star Trek like in a way, because obviously with Star Trek there's a whole group of people, and even in real life, if you think about like a Second World War plane or something, there might be one person piloting the plane, another person shooting the guns. Even something like that, there's kind of teamwork involved, which is very much how it is in Star Trek. But you don't get that in a game where you're just the player, because you're sort of doing it all. A, you're trying to sort of multitask it, but B, it immediately to me makes it feel more simplistic than it seems on screen, where you see like 5, 6, 7 people all coordinating to try and do something together. So that's interesting if the kind of VR approach and the kind of teamwork approach makes it more possible to capture that element of kind of collaborative playing, I suppose, which which again is something that you get in the holodeck, because any number of people can join the same holodeck program and play it together.
Yes. Well, and you know who all you're playing with. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
So basically, anyone you take into the holodeck with you, that's who you're playing with. And so you know everyone, and you're playing face to face, which makes everything a lot more realistic. I think, too, that because of the time in which Next Generation and Voyager and Deep Space Nine took place, that they don't have those sophisticated games on the holodeck because those things didn't exist in real life. No one could imagine that you could play a game that looks so realistic that you can see every leaf blowing on a tree. They didn't have that kind of foresight at the time. And I think that were we to have a lot of holodeck stuff on things that happened in future Star Trek, like after Deep Space Nine timeline-wise, that we might see more advanced things like that. I can't say, but it's kind of a moot point.
I suppose the thing is, like, for us, the pleasure of playing Star Trek games is going into that world, going into this sort of futuristic world. I mean, in the same way as the pleasure for the person in Star Trek is going into Sherlock Holmes or going into, it's partly like playing in a fictional world that we are, that appeals to us, that we're excited about, that we're very interested in and invested in. But yeah, I take your point. I suppose the question is how does that not become... Not that it's necessarily mundane, going back to these older, sort of more old-fashioned scenarios and going... A lot of the holodeck scenarios in Star Trek are about going back in time. There's no science fiction, apart from Captain Proton, which obviously is like a weird combination of science fiction and history. So it's all about history. And even, these are the Voyagers. It's literally, the holodeck is a kind of historical document, almost. It's like a kind of history textbook somehow.
If you say so.
We don't have to talk about that one. Possibly a wildly inaccurate history textbook that gets all the facts wrong.
History textbooks throughout time have been wildly inaccurate because it's always written by the winner.
That is true. So. That's definitely a game that doesn't seem... I mean, I'm glad that simulation helped Riker in some slightly undefinable way, but it didn't seem like it would be an enormously fun one to play through, to be honest, compared to, some of the games that we see. But I guess there is that question. I mean, that brings up an interesting question of, in that episode, just to talk about it for a moment, however bad the episode might be, there is this kind of interesting idea of using the holodeck to resolve a problem or to work out the idea. And I personally, I think they should have found a different way of... I think they could have brought in Riker and Troy without setting it in a Next Gen episode, and it would have been much more believable. And then having to find an episode where there was a dilemma that could plausibly have allowed enough time for someone to go to the holodeck and come back, and that to have affected their decision is ridiculous writing, as far as I can see. But I think there is the kernel of an interesting idea there, that you might go to the holodeck trying to kind of work that out. And I heard recently an interesting episode of Radiolab, the podcast Radiolab, which was about virtual reality. And they talked to this guy who tried out this program, which was a kind of virtual reality psychoanalysis program, basically. Mm-hmm. And it was very, very much in the model of Star Trek and the holodeck. It was basically, you have an encounter with Sigmund Freud. Obviously, Freud, crops up in Star Trek as a holographic character. And in this situation, this was not a holodeck, this was VR. So you put on the headset, and the guy described basically he put on the headset and he found himself in this kind of old, ornate office. And he sort of wandered around the office, like we've been talking about, exploring your environment and kind of looking around and so on. And then he realized there was someone sitting behind the desk, and he walked up to the desk, and sure enough, there was Sigmund Freud sitting behind the desk. And so he was a bit surprised. And then Sigmund Freud says to him in his sort of, Austrian accent or whatever, tell me about something that is troubling you. And so the guy had to think, and then he told him about something. It turned out it was basically, he'd made a decision to put his mother into a nursing home, and he wasn't sure if he'd put her into there was some decision as to whether to put her in a nursing home near to where he lived or near to where her friends lived, and had he done the right thing and so on, or should he have been seeing her more often, or should he have picked a different nursing home and so on. And the way the program worked was, as soon as he'd asked the question, the screen went blank, and then he popped up again, But he was, and the key thing, sorry, I should have mentioned this, was when he came into the room, there was a mirror. He walked past a mirror and he saw his own face reflected in the mirror. So his avatar in the virtual reality was based on a picture of himself. So it was like he was definitely meant to be himself. And so then the screen went blank and he popped up again. And this time he was sitting behind the desk and he had the beard and he was dressed like Sigmund Freud, and himself was standing on the other side of the desk looking like him, with a kind of photorealistic version of him. And it played back exactly what he'd just said, but his avatar speaking it, obviously, rather than, him literally speaking it. So it played back the audio. And then he, as Freud, had to carry on the conversation and ask a question or say this or that or whatever. So he said something kind of typically Freudian, like, well, why do you think you feel that? Or whatever. And then it popped back again. And then he was back being himself again. And then Freud was sat behind the desk saying it but with a kind of Freud accent filter, distorting his voice, saying in Freud's accent, exactly whatever it was he said. And it sort of basically kept hopping back and forth. And each time it would replay whatever he'd last said. And so really all he was doing was making both sides of the conversation, but having the last thing he'd said replayed back to him. But the fact that it was in this environment, the fact that he could physically see himself, it looked like him, the person that he was counselling. The fact that the counsellor looked like Sigmund Freud, even though he knew that he was the one feeding him everything to say, meant that he said it had this real therapeutic impact on him, basically. And it changed how he felt about himself and how he felt about the situation. And what he said was a large part of it was just seeing himself saying these things. He felt much more compassion for himself, and he felt more able to kind of see himself and the situation he was in, and it gave him a kind of objectivity on it. But also, I suppose, the fact of being in this environment, in this kind of, consulting room and with this kind of great figure of psychoanalysis sat there helping him, provided this sort of confidence somehow that the process was a valuable one and all this kind of thing. And it just sort of struck me that is, not a million miles away, I suppose, in some ways from what Riker's trying to do in that episode, go to the holodeck and get some kind of solace or some kind of help making a decision or whatever. But that is something that the development of new technologies is making possible, that can have it's not really about gaming. It's not about gaming at all, but it is about the development of virtual reality technology having a kind of beneficial effect. And I suppose for us, virtual reality is the closest to the holodeck that we're likely, frankly, probably ever to get, because the holodeck relies on a lot of pretty dubious physics and kind of, imaginative writing. But virtual reality, something like Ready Player One is actually more imaginable in a way, where everyone is physically strapped into a suit or strapped into a rig or something, but everything they see, smell, taste, touch is simulated to feel real to them. And that seems more kind of believable, and that might be more like the direction we'd be kind of going with. In reality, it might not be stepping into an empty room, but it might be stepping into a pod and then kind of experiencing exactly the kind of things that people experience on the holodeck in Star Trek.
Yeah, I can see that. It's the way that I feel about it is that nothing is impossible, really, because there's so much we don't know about science still. So I fully want to believe that holodeck technology is possible. Maybe not in the way that it's portrayed in Star Trek, but I want to feel like that it's possible, because it would be an amazing tool. It's not just for gaming. It's not just for reliving an historical event. There's many ways it can be used. It can be used for instruction. It can be used like that episode when Riker was on trial for killing this guy, and they were reconstructing everyone's version of the events in the holodeck. There was that episode of Next Gen that I can't remember the name of, where they all started having weird dreams, and they all get together and they recreate what they were seeing in their dreams in the holodeck.
Schisms.
Thank you. That's the one. And they would be taking into like an alternate dimension and having experiments done on them without their consent, etc. But that was a wonderful tool for them to all be able to create this thing so that they could get to the bottom of what was going on. So many wonderful ways to use it. Gaming is just but one. But for the most part, the holodeck seems to be used as a diversion of some sort. And everybody needs a diversion. And if you're on a spaceship in the middle of nowhere, And the holodeck's all you got. Hey, if you want, go in there and program a simulation where you're at an amusement park. You can do whatever you want. And I find that fascinating and kind of wish that we had them.
And realistically, gaming is the kind of diversion. You know, if you were on I was going to say, if you were on a nuclear submarine, I've no idea whether you can take a PlayStation on a nuclear submarine, but let's assume that you can. If you were in a kind of confined space, you know, that is equivalent to a starship, you get shore leave now and then, but mostly your recreational pursuits, you can, you know, they have the movie night, you can go and watch a film, you can kind of get together, you can go and have a drink maybe, but you are limited in terms of what you can do. And if you want to escape from your environment, whether that's being stuck on a ship in the Delta Quadrant, or, you know, being stuck on a submarine in the real world, or, you know, whatever it is, gaming, I suppose, is one very effective form of escape because it is so encompassing. I mean, obviously, you know, you might say, I'm going to read a novel and that will be my escape. And in my imagination, I'll go to this other world and I'll get involved in this story. And that's true, of course, as well, or watching a film. But I guess the fact of having it's not quite the same as virtual reality. It's not quite the same as the holodeck. It's not quite as real as that. You can't, you know, smell and taste it and everything. But there is the element. There's the visual element. There's the kind of oral element. There's the, you know, a good game does make you feel like you're in the moment somehow. And I remember being struck by this was when I was like a teenager maybe, and it must have been when games were starting to get more sophisticated and they were starting to get more, you know, like the sort of development of the kind of first person game to the point of view where you could sort of that barrier that there had been, where obviously, yes, you sort of identify with Mario jumping from block to block, but at the same time, you don't on any real level feel that you're Mario. You don't wince when he gets hurt or whatever. But there was some game, I can't remember what game it was, and something happened and I literally flinched and sort of jumped back from the computer. And I thought, and I noticed it at the time, I thought, wow, that's a game has not done that to me before, but it made me feel just for that split second like I was in danger because my character in the game was in danger and I had like made that kind of connection somehow between the two. And obviously the holodeck sort of does that for you because it puts you in that position physically and everything around you is reinforcing that idea that you're really there. It
is. That's gaming turned up to 11 right there.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you're no longer just holding a controller and changing what happens on the screen. You are now in it. You are the one running. You are the one hiding. You are the one shooting, if that's the kind of game you're playing. And it's a very, very different experience. So it's a good thing that those safety protocols are almost always on.
Well, before we go, Brandi, I just wanted to ask you, obviously, the answer to this might be kind of obvious, but if someone offered you a holodeck and said, what program would you want to play? What would you load up on there? Would it be one of the games that you play in real life? Would you play a holodeck version of that? Would it be one of the games that we see people in Star Trek playing? Obviously not the Western, by the sounds of it. You wouldn't be going for Alexander's Western program.
No,
would it be The Big Goodbye? Would it be the James Bond fantasy? What would it be? Beowulf? I don't know. You know, what would be your sort of, where would it take you?
Oh my goodness, that is a difficult question to answer because there are so many possibilities. I mean, you could even program a movie and live a movie. It's just, Probably my first instinct would be to start with a video game that I'm familiar with. Simply because it's familiar, and with it being in a whole new medium, I would want some sense of knowing what I needed to do so that I didn't feel completely stressed out. So I would probably actually... this sounds so silly. I would probably program in the very first RPG video game that I played on our very first disc system, which was a PlayStation. And I would create the world of Final Fantasy VII and just play that until I got to the end. And because that is a massive game, especially for the day. That was 1997. And it was 3 discs long. And it had this complex story. And yes, it was the graphics for the time were, but now, you know, by our standards, they're just, there's 16-bit stuff going on here. And yes, the cutscenes were lovely, but still, it was, 21 years later. But I just loved that world and that story and those characters so much that's probably the first thing I would do is go back and play in the holodeck Final Fantasy VII.
And that's interesting because it is a fantastical world. It is partly about that kind of world building, the kind of appeal of all that. I mean, I was going to say, the thing, of course, that people in Star Trek can't do that probably most of us might like to do is play Star Trek. I mean, that would probably be mine. Would be going, hang out on Deep Space Nine for a while, or the Enterprise or whatever. But I guess it is partly similarly. There's that element of the kind of fantastical, and I guess it's funny in a way that in Star Trek we don't see that. We don't see anyone going, why? Obviously there are licensing issues, but aside from that, why do we not see anyone playing The Lord of the Rings? Do you know what I mean?
Right?
Why do we see them playing Beowulf, which is a kind of well, I suppose that is a fantasy scenario with a monster and everything, but they're not playing kind of, fantasy in the kind of sci-fi and fantasy sense, in that kind of genre sense that we might associate with it, which is funny in a way. And we don't, and even in the Beowulf one, we never even see the monster in the program because it's been replaced by these weird alien what's-its. We certainly don't get as far as the dragon. We kind of don't get that. Game of Thrones, even they could be playing Game of Thrones if they want to. I imagine Quark could have a good sideline in that. But we don't. We see these kind of quite historical, quite kind of, in a way, quite sort of tame storylines in some ways. Even like you were saying, the Western, it's very much the kind of traditional sanitized version of the Western rather than the kind of gritty, edgier sort of version of it. They're playing the sort of tamer end of entertainment. But then maybe that's just Starfleet and that's the Federation. Maybe once if you go to some other planets and check out their holo technology, who knows what's going on over there? Who knows what the holo suites on Kronos are up to? Probably something pretty bloody and and grim.
I totally agree with that. Here's the thing I know about myself. I would not do well playing Star Trek. I would be the person who would be Guinan in 10 Forward. I am not cut out to be a Starfleet officer. I don't think like a Starfleet officer. I don't behave like a Starfleet officer. And I don't think I could do that in a game. Therefore, I would be the person that is not a Starfleet officer on board a starship. So Guinan for me.
Yeah, but Captain Picard is hopeless as Dixon Hill. He loves it, at least to begin with. Obviously he gets better at it. But I mean, that's part of the appeal, isn't it? Is of being able to do something that you step outside your comfort zone in a way. And, in the game, you'd be great. You'd be captain.
Yeah, I have no interest in being captain, though.
Okay.
It doesn't appeal to me. I like watching it.
Right, fair enough.
I don't want to be it. So there's not even a fantasy of being in command. Not my thing. I've been manager stuff before. I don't like being in charge at all. So
that is fascinating. I mean, there's that conversation in Future's End, isn't there, where Neelix and Kes get hooked on kind of 1990s soap operas, and they I think one of them says, there's this real pleasure in just letting it wash over you and just kind of absorbing the narrative and not having to be involved, that kind of, being an observer. So there you go. It's, takes all sorts. It's gaming has its place, but, it's not necessarily the be all and the end all, even with the holodeck.
No, it's a nice diversion, and that's what it's supposed to be. And when it starts to take over other parts of your life, that's when you need to take a step back and wonder what it is in you that is causing this to happen. So I've never had that problem. I know when to quit because I'm an adult.
Fair enough. Well, before we go, Brandi, why don't you let our listeners know where they can find you if they want to find you elsewhere on the Trek FM network, or if they want to find you on social media, or who knows, I don't know, if they want to find you in some online gaming forum. I don't know whether that's possible or not. You can tell how much I know about computer games, or at least modern computer games. Tell our listeners where they can find you if they don't already know, which I'm sure they do.
Oh, they might not all know. You can find me lurking in the Babel Conference on Facebook, of course. You'll also find me on the podcast Warp 5 on the Trek FM network with my good friends Brandon Shea Matala and Patrick Devlin. and we talk about Star Trek Enterprise. And you can find me on Twitter at Brandywine12. Brandi is spelled with an I, and 12 is a number. I also do a podcast with my wonderful husband, Dave, called The Dark Corner Podcast, which you can find at darkcornerpodcast.com. We do talk about a lot of pop culture things, and basically we're big nerds too. So we talk about just whatever we want in pop culture and nerd stuff, but we do it sort of from a different, darker point of view. And there are colorful metaphors in that. So please don't listen if you're offended by colorful metaphors.
Something which is noticeably absent from the holodeck generally, and slightly implausibly in Star Trek, I think. We don't get too much of that. I was just thinking, you were talking about social media, talking about Twitter and so on. Of course, one thing we could have talked about really is this idea of gamification. I don't know if you're sort of familiar with that concept, that basically, particularly in software programming, increasingly with social networking programs, that gaming models are brought into those programs as a way to make people keep using them. So something like Twitter, the number of likes, the number of retweets, this kind of emphasis on these kind of measures of popularity or success or something, not being a million miles away from the kind of games where you're sort of building your experience points or building your reputation or building your kind of status, in a sense that, something like Star Trek Online is not necessarily about reaching the end of the game, but it's about building yourself as a character or building yourself as a sort of brand almost. That some people would say some of these kind of social networking platforms, they hook you in by giving you these little rewards constantly. How many people retweeted me, how many people did this, and that's I guess when we're talking about addiction or whatever, that's one reason that people can get quite absorbed in these things. So gaming, I guess, is however we feel about it, it's a part of our lives in that sense. It's kind of it taps into our deepest wishes and desires and sometimes insecurities and it kind of it's a big part of our culture. It always has been. One way or another, whether it's jousting or all the way up to the latest Tomb Raider game or the latest expansion for Star Trek Online or whatever it is. It's something that has been a part of human culture one way or another for a while. So and certainly a part of Star Trek. But it's been great, Brandi, having you on the show. It's been great to have you come on and talk about this. It's been fun talking about gaming. It's nice to do a fun topic, I have to say. Clara and I have been doing a few pretty dark topics recently, so it's nice to be able to say, with no qualms, it's been fun talking about gaming in Star Trek this week. But that's not all we've been doing on Trek FM at the moment, so here's a listen to some of the other things you might have missed out on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
It's a white uniform, and you're dealing with medical blood, all this other stuff, fluids.
Yeah.
That thing ain't gonna stay white. So in my head, they're treated that it just doesn't even stick. It just repels off it.
Earl Grey.
So Picard says he won't transfer anyone off the ship, but as a compromise, get ready for this. As a compromise, he will reassign Worf as Wesley's tutor.
I love that. Yes. Put some discipline in that boy.
Oh my gosh, that's so funny.
This is like a choice you could, I don't know. I would imagine.
Man, I really like this story
like
now.
It? Yeah. There's more later, but yeah, Worf as Wesley's tutor.
Melodic Treks.
And, I talked to the producers when I first did the show, and the first thing they had me do was take a combination of the dun da 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 da, the Sandy Courage wonderful horn theme, and Jerry's da 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 da, his theme for the first movie, and make a theme out of those and combine them. So I did it electronically, and they said good enough. And I said, "Look, this is not my specialty." And they said, "Never mind, you got it." So 18 years later, that was it.
The 602 Club.
I did definitely feel what you're saying, Matt, like it was a Bond greatest hits in that opening sequence. You've got Russians again, or supposed to be in Russia. You've got, a group of terrorists all gathering together about, all these different weapons, and you're trying to ID people, and then, we of course bring back in M, and then she's having to argue now with the government and the military, and then I like that they kind of bring in Bond in a subtle way, calling him White Knight this time. That was cool, but yeah, I think otherwise it feels very familiar, but in a great way. I feel like Arnold dealing with the music And then the actors as well, taking good direction, made a lot of intensity in that scene. So you don't feel like you're moving into the film slowly. They're coming at you full force, and then, Bond runs off with the plane. So I really liked it.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and in most third-party apps. And you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place is to join the larger conversation at the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type in Babel, that's B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture. That will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. We are Primitive Culture and we are your hosts. My name is Clara Cook and you can find me on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC. My co-host is Duncan Barrett and you can find Duncan on Twitter at Barrett's Books. If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month. We really appreciate any support you can give us and hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM. Now I'd like to express a big thank you to our executive producer, Amy Nelson. You can find Amy Nelson on the Earl Grey podcast on Trek FM. So thank you everyone for listening to this episode of Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast about our history, our culture, and how Star Trek relates to it.
You blend it all.